Hi everybody, welcome back to Women in Literature. What I wanted to do today is to put some closure to Jane Eyre and also give you a sense of what's happening for the remainder of this semester. As you can see in the notes above, I should have returned your journals on persuasion to you. So if that hasn't happened, please let me know. At this point, you should have submitted in your first paper, and I will be getting that back to you shortly, and I will return that in the same way that I return your journals. In terms of our course outline, believe it or not, we're coming towards the ending of the semester. Time just disappeared. So what I thought we would do on this upcoming Tuesday, the 30th, is that we would talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson. In fact, at the ending of today, I'll give you a documentary for you to view about Emily Dickinson, and then I'll share some information about Emily Dickinson next week, and also begin Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And this narrative happens to be one that is fairly simply written, so you should be able to read it quickly. That said, I forewarn you now that the topic is very graphic. So that said, I think it's important from a historical perspective. And in terms of thinking about journals, I'm hoping that by Tuesday of next week, the 30th, or before, you can submit in your journal on Jane Eyre. And then what that would mean is that the following Thursday actually puts us into July 2nd. And we could put closure on the Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and also talk about The Awakening, that novella that I was indicating by Kate Chopin. So we end the class the way that we began the class. And that date, the 2nd, is when it would be nice if you could hand in your journal. But I thought that I would give you up until Saturday, the 4th of July, by midnight to hand in your journal. I know Saturday, the 4th of July, is a holiday, but I wanted to give you 48 hours from our Thursday class. So hopefully that'll be enough time for you to be able to submit in that particular journal. And then finally, our very last class is due is on the 7th, which is Tuesday, which is when journal number 5 is going to be due. That'll be The Awakening, and I will post our final examination. If we were meeting in class, we would take the final examination in class. As you know, obviously we're not meeting in class, so what I thought I would do is give you a 24-hour period to do the final exam. So I'll post the final exam at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of July. And you've got up until the 9th of July, 9 o'clock in the morning, to submit in that final exam. It'll be open book, open notes, a series of essay questions. You can reference things like your journals and your notes. And basically it's a way to synthesize everything that we've been talking about over the course of the class. That would also be the last date that you could hand in paper number 2, the 9th of July. By then you will definitely have paper number 1 back with my comments. So hopefully you can duplicate the same exercise with paper number 2 with one of the latter set of readings. And if any of you elected to do a revision of your first paper, that would be due also by the 9th of July by 9 a.m. So in terms of Jane Eyre, you can see that I've continued on. Last class, I went to approximately halfway through the book. We were in the Thornfield section and talking a little bit about the significance of Thornfield, that a field represents all of the many positive things that will be occurring and do occur to Jane when she's there. But thorn also suggests that there are going to be painful things and negative things that occur to Jane when she's there. Where we left off was chapter 19. This is when Rochester and his circle of friends, including his girlfriend, have returned, and basically Rochester has insisted that Jane remain in their presence, even though she's from a different social status, a different class. And this is particularly difficult for Jane because ultimately she's fallen in love with Rochester at this particular point. And in chapter 19, a very strange episode where a gypsy woman seems to come and to give everyone their fortunes, specifically asking for the single women. And when Jane's turn comes, the gypsy woman says, and this is in the notes above. You are cold because you are alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You are sick because the best of feelings, the highest and sweetest to man, keeps far away from you. You are silly because, suffer as you may, you will not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it waits you. And then Jane thinks to herself, or basically the gypsy woman says, your brow professes to say, I can live alone if self-respect and the circumstances require me to do so. I have an inward treasure born with me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give. I'm hopeful that by this point in the novel you've noticed that there's a good amount of foreshadowing, that there are hints embedded within the novel of events that will occur later. So this dialogue is going to be very important. And when we continue on, basically what we find out is that this gypsy woman is Rochester himself under the guise of a gypsy woman. So we can begin wondering what would motivate Rochester first to engage in this ridiculous scheme, and secondly to say what he says to Jane. And it doesn't take too much imagination to figure out that perhaps he has feelings for Jane, much like she has feelings for him. When we move to chapter 20, this is where we learn about the mysterious Mr. Mason who happens to be stabbed. And while Rochester goes to get medical help, all of this is kept very secret. Jane has to nurse Mr. Mason back to health. We talked about that a little bit in The Cult of True Womanhood, about the role of woman as caretaker. There will be a little bit of foreshadowing here as well, because Jane is also going to be doing some nursing later on in the novel. And what Jane says to Rochester is a very telling quote, also in the notes. If anyone you know has suffered an error, let him look higher than his equals for strength to amend and solace to heal. And at this particular point, Jane is talking about God. And we know that Jane's experiences with religion, at least organized, hypocritical religion, illustrated by the Brocklehursts of the world, not gone well. That's not to say that Jane doesn't have spirituality and an understanding of God. That's something that Helen Burns was able to give to Jane. And Jane talks a little bit about the idea of being faithful to God and to a higher power. And that's something that Jane will be relying on as the book continues. Then we find out in chapter 21, we return back to the Reeds, which is where Jane began her journey when she was a little girl. It turns out that her cousins are all grown up. John Reed basically has led a rather scandalous life, and he's now dead. The rumor is suicide. Jane returns to Thornfield because her aunt, who is on her sick bed, in part because of the death of her son, has requested to speak with Jane. And Jane feels enough sense of honor and duty to do that, despite how she was treated as a child at that point. And what she finds are her two female cousins, what they've become as women. Georgiana has become a spoiled, arrogant woman looking for a good match, basically. Someone to marry, a rich suitor. And now that we've read Persuasion, that probably makes even more sense. Eliza has gone to the other extreme. She's become this cold, hard, distant, religious woman, planning to join a nunnery. And again, this is another commentary from the author about religion, that religion can be filled with hypocrisy, or it can be filled with such coldness and such hardness that there really isn't any kind of life associated with it. Mrs. Reed, on her deathbed, refuses to accept Jane's attempts at reconciliation, which illustrates how Jane has matured as an individual and grown. Mrs. Reed is not. And Mrs. Reed reveals to Jane that the reason why she wanted to speak to her is because she's kept the secret from Jane, and she wants her soul to be clean before she goes into the afterlife, and that it is a letter that Mrs. Reed had received from a relative of Jane's. It turns out that Jane is not an orphan. She does have a distant uncle, and he was looking for her so that he could adopt her. And Mrs. Reed did not give Jane that information. So basically, Jane has spent a lot of time alone and penniless for no good reason. When we get to chapter 23, at this particular point, Jane has left the Reeds and she goes back to Thornfield, and this is when Rochester admits his feelings to Jane after he continually, you know, begins to suggest that he might be interested in another woman. And when Jane asks him why he chose that particular route to woo her, he says that he wanted to make her jealous. Rochester's a problematic character. There are lots of negative qualities associated with him. He will definitely have to be humbled over the course of this novel. He very much represents the Byronic hero, Byron would be one of the great romantic poets during this time period. And as we talked about with Frankenstein, this is the romantic time period. This brooding male with some dark secret that proves his virility through sexuality. And basically when Rochester proposes to Jane, he's smoking a cigar. If you've ever taken Psych 101 and done any studying with Freud, then you know that that cigar is probably a phallic symbol in one way or another. One of the things that Jane talks about is that she has passion, a passion that isn't necessarily accepted by the church, but it's one that she feels is necessary in order to be true to herself and to live life to the fullest. And even though it's not specifically or explicitly addressed in this novel, the assumption is that there's a sexual passion here, as well as a meeting of temperaments between Rochester and Jane. This is more than just a convenient match for political reasons. In fact, it's rather astonishing that Rochester would choose Jane, considering the fact that she's from a completely different station, and also she's much younger than he is. But at this particular point, the idea is that they're so well suited in terms of temperament that this would be a good match. At that point, or shortly thereafter, lightning strikes and splits the chestnut tree that was outdoors that they were speaking at. Again, a little bit of foreshadowing that perhaps some negative things will be occurring. In chapter 24, a very telling chapter, because Rochester at this point, now that he can freely admit his feelings towards Jane, wants to basically treat her the way he would treat any other woman that he is in love with silks and pearls, and Jane refuses and keeps him at bay by stating, "I will not be your English Celine Varens." Think about this when we talk a little bit about foreshadowing, that she says that she will not act like his mistress. "I shall continue to act as Adele's governess," is what she says instead. "And by that, I shall earn my board and lodging, and you shall give me nothing." And she's doing this to keep him in reasonable check. And I think there are 2 points here. The sense of independence that Jane has, especially during this time period. She wants to keep her job. She wants to keep her financial independence, so she's not reliant or dependent upon Rochester. It's a very modern idea. And also the idea of keeping him in reasonable check. The assumption is that the author is suggesting that the best way to keep someone interested in a relationship is not necessarily to give them everything that they say they want, but to play a little bit hard to get. And Rochester did that initially with his gypsy woman, and also with the idea that he was acting like he had a girlfriend that he was interested in, and he's not interested in her at all, because he's quite aware that all she's interested in is money. So this is Jane's turn to perhaps turn the tables, if you will, and do a little bit of teasing of Rochester. But in chapter 25, we see Jane has some very disturbing dreams, and again, a little bit of foreshadowing that something negative might be happening. Perhaps Jane's subconscious has an understanding that there's something not quite right. She wakes up to find her wedding veil ripped in two. Rochester says that she must have done it herself in her sleep, though she maintains that it was this shadowy figure that came into her room. And then in chapter 26, we get our big reveal that it turns out Mr. Rochester was married and still is married. And he's married to Mr. Mason's sister, Bertha, which is why Mr. Mason was visiting. And she is insane and is being hidden by Grace Poole in Thornfield. So basically the idea of the laugh, that wasn't coming from Grace Poole. Grace Poole is the caretaker of the mad woman who's hidden in the attic, so to speak. And the idea of Bertha is a complicated one. The way that she's presented in this particular novel is a kind of obstacle for Rochester and for Jane, though certainly if we thought about this from Bertha's perspective, she comes from Jamaica and basically was given to Rochester as a prize, a good match, if you will. And then after their marriage, he finds out that she's emotionally unstable and she continues to deteriorate until she becomes much like this wild beast. She's oftentimes been compared to the idea of what happens when you have unrestrained passion. You can go to the extreme of insanity. It's something that Jane considers later on when she thinks about running away with Rochester or marrying Rochester, even though he's already a married man. The idea of balance, something that we saw in Persuasion, is also something that we see in Jane Eyre. Religion needs to have a balance. It can't be hypocritical, but it also can't be too cold and hard. And it's the same sort of idea with passion. Passion that's completely unrestrained leads to the descent into the bestial. But passion that's completely restrained leads to a lack of love and a lack of affection. There's got to be a combination of the two. But if you've ever heard of Jean Rice's Wide Sargasso Sea, it happens to be the story of Bertha, where many readers have read Jane Eyre and have wondered what is Bertha's story. And one reader and author was so inspired by that she decided that she would provide Bertha's backstory from her imagination. So perhaps when the class is over, you might be able to read Wide Sargasso Sea. But at any rate, at this point, chapter 27, Jane thinks to herself, because obviously she's devastated, "None shall help you. You shall help yourself. Pluck out your right eye. Cut off your right hand." Keep that in mind when we talk about foreshadowing. And she resists the temptation of becoming Rochester's mistress. And basically what she tells him is, do as I do. Trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven. Hope to meet again there. Because she thinks, I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. What an incredibly modern, an incredibly contemporary message. The idea of one needing to find fulfillment within oneself before one can find fulfillment with another. It's one of the reasons why this novel perhaps is still so popular to this day. And at that particular point, and Jane flees into nature. And we've seen the idea of nature being presented as a kind of female figure, definitely is presented as a female figure in this text. In fact, it's even referenced as the universal mother, which is quite appropriate for Jane because she's been motherless. The universal mother who's benign and good. We saw in Frankenstein the positives associated with nature and the natural world. And this is where Jane has to suffer the physical and the emotional pain of becoming a beggar. And as honorable as Jane is, she certainly has her faults and flaws. If you remember at the beginning of the novel, when she was a child, she was told that she wouldn't want to belong to poor people, no matter if that meant independence for her. Now we have an adult Jane who is going to become one of those poor people and is being forced to beg in the streets and basically has no food and has no water. And looks like she's at the point of death until she happens to be rescued. And this is where we get an introduction to a whole other set of characters. And this is where we end up in another section of the novel, Marsh End or Moor House. And the names can sort of indicate to you what might be happening. This is going to be the end of the marsh or the end of bad times for Jane. And it's a house where she's going to find more. The idea that there's going to be an end to her suffering. This is where we are introduced to the Rivers family, Mary and Diana and St. John. And Jane spends 3 days basically recuperating in bed. She awakes the third day. 3 is a very powerful Christian symbol. It represents resurrection. And this is both the physical and spiritual resurrection that Jane experiences. At this point, she tells the housekeeper that poverty is not a crime, something that Jane has learned firsthand, something that Jane didn't know of when she was a child. Yes, she was poor, but she was living in a very affluent situation nevertheless. And the housekeeper learns from Jane that yes, poverty isn't necessarily a crime. And then we find in chapter 30 that Jane begins to bond with the two women there, Mary and Diana. Not so much with St. John. He does offer her a humble job of teaching poor children, which Jane accepts. And again, a very honest Jane and a very flawed Jane admits that basically she felt degraded by the ignorance, the poverty, and the coarseness of her pupils. But she knew those feelings were wrong and she was striving to overcome them. So Jane humanly struggles with the idea of poverty and the idea of individuals who may not necessarily have her intellectual or even emotional capabilities. At this point, also the Rivers family learns that their long lost Uncle John has died, not left them an inheritance. They were hopeful that he would, and that would improve their financial situation. Not that they are poverty stricken, but they certainly aren't as affluent as, let's say, the Reed family was when Jane was growing up. And at this particular point, we learn a little bit also about St. John and how he's struggling against his attraction to a rich but a vivacious Miss Oliver. She's presented in a very positive way. Just because she has money, that doesn't necessarily mean that she's empty and vacuous. That said, he's decided that he needs to devote his life to God, and that some of his personality traits of being cold and hard and ambitious would work very well with the religious world. In some ways, he's very much like a Brocklehurst, but without the hypocrisy. Again, sort of a negative portrayal of ambition. In chapter 33 is where St. John learns that this Jane Elliot, who happens to be staying with them, has been under a pseudonym, and really her name is Jane Eyre. And she's become quite famous because she's all over the media that exists at the time, because Mr. Rochester has been feverishly searching for her and been unable to find her. And this is where we get our second big reveal, that basically St. John, Mary, and Diana Rivers are all Jane's cousins. It turns out the Uncle John that they were talking about was a rich bachelor who didn't leave his inheritance to the Rivers family. He left it instead to his other orphan niece that didn't know that he was alive, an orphan niece named Jane Eyre. And basically what this means is that now she is a very wealthy woman. What motivated his behavior is that he was angry with the Rivers family, and that his sister had married basically a poor clergyman. Again, the idea, the importance of making a good match. In chapter 34, Jane decides to share evenly her fortune with her cousins. The idea that Jane is magnanimous, Jane is fair, Jane is honorable, and that this is the right thing to do as opposed to the pettiness illustrated by her uncle. She's overjoyed and talks about wealth not just in terms of money, but in terms of family. In other words, orphan Jane is no longer alone. She has found her family, helping to explain the bond that she has with her two female cousins. At this point, St. John proposes to Jane, asking her to become his wife as a missionary and join him in India with his missionary work to serve God. And Jane refuses. Part of this, I've always suspected, is because Jane has a certain level of financial independence, even though that isn't necessarily discussed that much in the text. What Jane talks about is that she's unable to sacrifice basically her sense of honor, and that she wouldn't be able to marry a man that she doesn't love. And that has to have some truth to it, because if she were purely concerned with money, she would have married Rochester despite the fact that he was already married, but she felt that was morally wrong, so she wouldn't do that. And after Jane refuses, and St. John does not take that particularly well, in chapter 35, Jane hears Rochester's voice from afar calling her. It seems to be almost like a supernatural event. Many of the supernatural events that seemingly occur in this text could be explained away as coincidence, or as we find out later on, there's some sort of a natural cause for them. For instance, the eerie laugh, as we find out, is really caused by nothing supernatural, but instead by a wife that Rochester is keeping hidden. But this really can't be explained, especially because Jane decides to return back to Thornfield and find Rochester. And when she does, he tells her that he also heard her saying that she was coming. So if there's any supernatural event in this text, which is a Gothic text, as well as a romance and a fairy tale in many respects, then that's going to be the moment. At any rate, in chapter 36, Jane returns to Thornfield to find that Thornfield has been ravaged by fire. It's been completely destroyed. And she learns that Rochester, he survived the fire, but he was maimed and also blinded in trying to save his wife, Bertha. So he was trying to do the honorable thing. It also means that he's now a widow, and if we're going to have a happy ending, this would be the way we're going to have a happy ending. He could never really divorce her, but if it turns out that she dies and it's not his fault, this does make him available for Jane, which is where we're going to end up at the ending of the novel. And it's not too surprising that he loses his sight. He has not had vision or understanding of himself and others in the world. He's been way too arrogant and has lacked humility. It's an idea we see in other texts, something like Oedipus the King, if you know anything about Greek drama, and Sophocles, where he blinds himself because basically he's lacked insight throughout the play. And so this idea that Rochester has not had sight, and then now that he's lost his sight, ironically, Rochester has insight. And now that he's been humbled and he's found a way to reconnect with his spirituality and with God, he and Jane reunite. And that gets us to chapter 37 with our happy ending. And the happy ending is that they marry, and that we have now Jane as an adult speaking in the present. All of this has been her reflections. And they've been married 10 years. They have a son, so they've basically created a family of their own. They also have Adele as a woman for part of Rochester's family, and Mrs. Fairfax. And then, of course, there also is Jane and her newfound Rivers family, especially her two female cousins, where they have close affinity with. And Rochester regains some of his sight, which also thematically is significant because he has achieved a certain level of insight. So, a long book, but a very interesting book. When I think about some of the themes in this book, themes about gender, what it means to be a woman in this time period, themes about class, what it means to be rich or poor in this time period, themes about religion and some of the ways that religion is used as a weapon against others, and oftentimes is filled with hypocrisy, and that many social institutions and many individuals from different classes are filled with a certain level of hypocrisy. And the importance of embracing one's honor in the midst of all of this. Those are just a few of the things to think of in terms of Jane Eyre. So I thought that for today's attendance or participation question on our form, I'd ask you to identify one quote in the text that you find particularly compelling or interesting in Jane Eyre, and to briefly indicate why. And there are a whole lot to choose from because there's a whole lot going on in this particular text. So I'm curious to see which one particularly spoke to you. I suspect there might be many, but you need to identify only one. And you can see that I've given you a little bit of an assignment, so that rather than reading about Emily Dickinson, I have a documentary for you to view on Emily Dickinson, and I've included the link above. This will give you an overview a little bit of Miss Emily, as she is fondly called in this area. Next class, what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about Emily Dickinson and her poetry, and I'll have our forum talk a little bit. Our forum question will be a little bit about Emily Dickinson. You don't have a journal about Emily Dickinson because I sort of see her as kind of the bridge here, though certainly if you wanted to earn a little extra credit and wanted to submit in a journal response about Emily Dickinson, you're free to. But your next journal after you've submitted in a journal for Jane Eyre happens to be about incidents in the life of a slave girl, which I will also begin next class. So that'll be a faster read, so we'll be able to do that as well as The Awakening with the time that we have left. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. I'll be on Zoom from 12 to 12:30 as usual on our class for Thursday. And I hope you have a good weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.